recording, and I'm gonna now share my screen. Can I get a thumbs up from the panel to show me that you can actually see the slides or the slide deck?
We got it.
Great. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this year's State DOT Roundtable with CTAA, a joint peer exchange. My name is Richard Price. I'm staff liaison to the AASHTO Council on Public Transportation and its Multi-State Transit Technical Assistance Program. Now, before we go ahead and get started, I would be remiss if I didn't honor a very, very special day that is today. Ladies and gentlemen, happy Star Wars Day, and may the 4th be with you. Now, a proper response to that would be, and also with you, or may the 4th be with us all, as I digress.
Okay.
Now let's go through some housekeeping items. First, as I said before, I'm recording and all the information from this peer exchange will be posted to the Council on Public Transportation and MTAP's website. It will be shared, of course, with CTAA and distributed via our MTAP e-news. And I just thought that you all should, if you don't have a copy of that or you're not subscribed to it, let me see if we can get the chat to work. But of course, the chat isn't working. I will share the link to the e-news. So if you feel like to subscribe, you can. Next, for all participants, all participants, please keep your mic and your camera off unless you are speaking and or you are a panelist. So this way we can highlight who the panelists are. Next, I want to thank AASHTO's premier and capital sponsors for their financial support, without which we could not hold events like this. But next, I'm going to encourage people to use the chat, not only to communicate with your colleagues, communicate with your panelists, but also communicate with me if there's a technical issue happening. But let's start with the first chat of the day, and that's a virtual roll call. So send the chat, use the chat function, and send me your name, send me your title, send me your organization, and also tell us your personal reasons for attending today's session. What do you hope to get out of it? And next, I'm going to now introduce our moderator, Charles Carr, Research Chair of the Council on Public Transportation and MTAP. He's a board member of CTAA, and he's with Mississippi DOT. Charles, please take it away.
All right. Thank you, Richard, and welcome to everyone who's agreed to join us. We feel very fortunate to have an opportunity to have this discussion. We look forward to a really good sharing opportunity. I think we've got a really good panel. We want to talk about the challenges and opportunities that we have in common as we go about responding to how we are obligating and expending federal funds, the influx of additional funds that are coming to transit as a result of these unprecedented times. Somewhere I read recently that although there are a number of outstanding questions that are still need to be answered, and the jury is out on how the funding has been spent and what the impact is going to be, and there will be things that we're still going to have to consider about demographics, the impact of the economy, how does technology play into what we're doing, and of course, the P word, politics. The one thing that I think we can all agree on, at the end of the day, transit is still needed. The mobility future is being rewritten by folks just like the people on this call today, and working with our partners and through our ridership, our customers, I think we have a pretty bright future. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on the weeds, getting down into the weeds, but we have a series of questions that we're going to get to when when we move to the next section of today's peer exchange. I'm going to take a few minutes here and introduce AASHTO's president, Jim Timon, and he'll be followed by the executive director of the Community Transportation Association of America, Scott Bogren. So Jim, I'm tossing it to you.
Well, thank you, Charles. I appreciate that. I'm AASHTO's executive director. I appreciate the promotion, but I certainly wouldn't want that to be confused with Victoria Sheehan, who is our president here at AASHTO.
So noted.
Well, I also want to recognize, I think we've got Roger Millar on the call as well. He's our the chair of our Council on Public Transportation, so certainly welcome him. And then I think Don from who's our chair from for our MTAP program is also on. So really want to just thank everybody for being here, and thank you, Charles, for moderating. It's really important, I think, for us to come together in this peer exchange with CTAA to talk about some of these really important issues that we're going to be dealing with as it relates to some of the COVID funding that we've been lucky enough to receive here through the last 3 or 4 pieces of federal legislation. So I'm really happy to be hosting this, or for AASHTO to be co-hosting this here with Scott and CTAA. We've got a great relationship between the two organizations, and I think Scott and I work very well together. And I think it's important for us to note that one of the reasons that we're doing this is that the idea for this peer exchange was really developed from a monthly meeting that Scott and I and Paul Skatellis from APTA participate in with the Federal Transit Administration. It's something that started under the previous administration, and then when Neria Fernandez came in as the acting administrator for FTA, she wanted to keep that regular meeting, and we do this, like I said, on a monthly basis. And during one of our recent meetings, FTA was expressing some concern with how the states and transit agencies were obligating and expending the different streams of funding that they received for transit through the pandemic relief bills, the CARES Act, the CRRSAA Act, and ARPA, and really wanted us to come together to be able to identify some of those best practices where our members were being able to work together to manage those funding streams and get that money out the door as quickly as possible. So we said, we would work together, Scott and I, to pull something like this together, a peer exchange, so that we could identify those best practices and really highlight some of those great partnerships that are occurring between AASHTO members and CTAA members. So we're really excited about this. I also want to note that, we normally do this roundtable in person, sitting around an actual table at the CTAA Expo. But since this year's CTAA Expo will be held actually later this year in the fall in Richmond, and it's going to be around the same time as when AASHTO would normally hold their public transportation and MTAP winter meeting. We're going to plan to actually bring those two groups together and hopefully be able to co-locate the Council on Public Transportation and MTAP winter meeting during the CTAA Expo this year in Richmond this fall. So we're looking forward to that collaboration as well. And we're looking forward to today's conversation. So again, I want to thank all of you for attending this peer exchange, and let me introduce my friend and colleague, Scott Bogren, who's the executive director for CTAA.
Thanks, Jim. And really thanks a lot for pledging to bring folks together at our conference in Richmond. We're looking forward to not meeting around a virtual roundtable, but having a real one and being able to get back into the swing of things. And I really wanted to echo a lot of what Jim had to say, and the impetus for this kind of peer exchange is, I think, bringing some common sense to how we are all dealing with an unprecedented situation, which is $70 billion in COVID stimulus operating funding, largely operating, and how to deal with that. And so I asked Richard if he could queue up a couple of slides just that we had put together for our folks, and you can go to the next one, Richard, on kind of, CARES Act, just so everyone understands exactly what we're talking about here. And I know most of you do, but, $25 billion passed a little bit about 13 months ago now, and really was essential in maintaining transit services of all sizes for that period between when this passed and on the next slide, when the CRISA Act at the end of December passed. Major change, the CARES Act fund largely followed traditional formula funding. The CRISA started to see specialized formulas being developed based around 2018 operating caps. We were, CTAA, unhappy with the CRISA Act and expressed that to Congress. We felt like small, urban, and rural were really left out, although we were finally happy to see some 5310. And then last came the rescue plan, the ARPA, the largest tranche of these funds, $30.5 billion, the only one with a time limit, and really making up for a lot of, every system got something. And the next slide is really, I think, the context I wanted to provide at the start here. We are being asked, how fast can you spend these funds? And we're being asked that at a point when we know rural transit, small urban transit, state managed transit doesn't spend money fast. And in fact, because of the nature of it being a reimbursement program, my answer to a lot of those questions, when I've received those questions from members of Congress, has been, for the rural piece, it's 5% of the total. And don't forget that. And if we're talking small urban, it's another small sliver. So within that 10% of the total, by the way, still a very large number, $7 billion. Nothing obviously to sneeze at, but we need to be able to have this discussion so that we can show Congress that these funds are needed and valued, even if they're not being spent in as quickly a fashion as they'd like, because of the nature of the systems, because of the nature of the communities, and because of the nature of the economic conditions in those communities. So I echo Jim. I really look forward to being informed by this dialogue. I'm so happy that we can be a part of this and continue this partnership with AASHTO. Richard, Shane, appreciate all the work you put in, Chris Steilinger as well. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to a member of CTA's board of directors and someone I certainly consider a friend, Charles Carr at the Mississippi DOT. Back to you, Charles.
Thank you, Scott. And I'll remind you that the script I wrote for you, there were a couple of other lines you left off, so that's going to cost you a little on your honorarium. Thank you. But in all seriousness, folks, this is a great opportunity. And going forward, as we get into the panel discussion, I want to bring a few key words to mind that will hopefully we'll see themes throughout this discussion. And these are things that I think reflect where we are really going. Chris and Jim, as well as a number of other folks, have talked about spending the money down. That's one of the things that we've heard from everyone, the questions from the congressional level. Well, we've got some challenges and opportunities. Those are two key words that we want to look at today. But we also want to talk about partnership and planning. And I think some of the responses to the questions that we've developed here will demonstrate that that's really a significant part of where we're going and how we've been doing it so far. But finally, to look at, get that outward look. What's next? How do we move from here so that we can have not only transparency, but we can have impactful change? So thank you to the folks who've joined us just recently on the line. We've got a wonderful panel here today. We've got representation from direct recipients, transit provider community. We've also got representation from, the MPO community. And we've got tribal representation. So I think we've got a pretty broad range of participants that can give us really thoughtful impact. What we're going to do is start a series of questions. We're going to offer those out for the panelists today. I'm going to introduce them. Most of you that, Richard, this screen shows the panelists and their names. We're going to leave that up, right?
Yes, we are.
Okay, good. Today joining us, we have Andy Brush from Michigan DOT, Don Chartock from Washington State DOT, Kristen Haar from Iowa DOT, Kendra McGeady, Pelivan, I think I'm saying that correctly. Kendra?
Yes, you are, sir. Thank you.
Okay, Pelivan Transit from Big Cabin, Oklahoma. Okay, Matt Schriefer from Evansville MPO, and Dee Gastea. Do I get an A for it?
Close.
I tried.
Thank
From
you.
the Maricopa Association of Governments. And what we're going to do now is go into the questions. And again, we're not asking each panelist to get in deep into the weeds, but to give some answers that gives the folks on the call today an appreciation for what this question represents from your perspective at the local level. The first question we're going to throw out regarding the annual apportionments and the emergency relief, that's CARES Act, CRISA, and ARP as well. What are the challenges you have faced in terms of obligating and expending the funding? And when you identify those challenges, how have you overcome those challenges? So why don't we start with Kristen?
Sure. So we have been challenged, I think, by several things. One is the overlapping timeframes for the effective dates of all of these funds, especially with our typical allotment of 5311, 5310 money overlapping, with CARES money. That was our first concern last spring. And a lot of our transit agencies, what do we spend first was a question we would receive quite frequently. So we were challenged with how to answer that. We were also challenged with not knowing how long the pandemic would last, of course, and whether or not to allow our transit agencies to use these monies on capital items when we felt like the spirit of the funding was for operating to keep our transit agencies, alive. But at the same time, because capital was allowed, knowing whether or not to allow these monies to be spent, on building items or what have you. So that was another challenge that we've had. And then for our local transit agencies, I think a challenge that was experienced and probably still is because this is 100% money, for which we are very grateful. The local transit agencies haven't needed to use their local match. And some of them were worried that if they didn't use their local match, it would go away permanently because they, hadn't proven that they needed it. So that might get replaced in their local member government budgets. So that was another challenge that they've had to work through with all of this. Overcoming all of this, we found a good balance, I think, with capital and operating, and doing the operating first and then seeing where we sat. And the other two bills obviously have helped with that, CRISA and ARP. But the other challenges, I'm not sure that they're completely resolved yet, but of course we'll work through it all because we're still in the pandemic. So we'll work through it.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Don Chardock out of Washington State DOT.
Thanks, Charles. I suspect many of the states have very similar problems, but I'll try to highlight on some of the things that might be unique to Washington State. The main way that Washington State funds their transit systems is through a local sales tax. And sales tax is boom and bust in uncertain times. And so one of the real tricks that we had to think through and figure out what to do is, how are we going to quantify the need? You know, when we were, so first when CARES Act came in, how do we quantify the need? In the end, I'm pretty proud of the work that we did. We have a really close relationship with our providers. We had a series of virtual meetings, and in the end decided to take, well, at least in the beginning, decided to take an approach of operations on one side and revenue on the other, so that we made our first awards just based on the size of everyone's operations, with assumption that that the size of the hurt due to the pandemic was going to be similar to the size of their operations. And then we held back half, thinking we were going to do a revenue analysis a little bit later. That ended up being problematic because our State Department of Revenue allowed a lot of flexibility to counties and cities to delay submitting their sales tax. And so it was going to end up being a problem that would be maybe months late before we figured out what all the revenue stream was. And so we ended up using that operations half as our approach. Lo and behold, CRISA comes along, and they essentially used that same methodology for the awards under CRISA. And so it really worked well, and we ended up continuing our, of course, in the end, the biggest problem that we faced is a lot of money and a little time. And so that we had to work pretty hard to figure out the right approach to help everyone. The other kind of unique first-time thing that happened for us is that we've never given 5311 to ferries before. And so ferries in Washington State were a huge reason why we got as much money as we did. And so we kind of broke our long-standing rule and opened up the process to make sure that we gave some to the Washington State ferries and a few other local rural ferries as well. And that was a challenge also because all of ferries funding is appropriated by the legislature. And so it was a chance that we've always done our 5311 and 5307 as pure pass-through money before, so that we've never had to have that money appropriated. And so we had to work very closely with our legislative staff and FTA region office in order to work that through. In the end, all of those things were manageable. A lot of now waiting to kind of see what the next shoe is to drop and anticipating the next challenges. But that's it for a nutshell for me.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Let us move now to the MPO perspective. Let's look at Matt. Have you got something you can share with us, please?
Yeah, so my answers are going to be kind of two-part, because through the MPO here, we've got, we supply Section 5310 funding to area nonprofits for their seniors and individuals with disabilities programs. And we also work with two separate city-operated transit agencies to complete their applications. So some of the challenge first for the nonprofits in the Section 5310 funds was, there was no CARES funding for any of them, as we saw earlier. And so whenever the CRSA and the ARP funds came out, we were pleasantly surprised, but at $43,000 each for those two programs, it wasn't going to be, it's not going to be a lot. So we're trying to figure out how to stretch that as far as possible to help as many of the nonprofits as we can. The second challenge was deciding what all should be eligible through this program. Section 5310 program, typically we just provide funding for vehicle acquisitions to the nonprofits, but they don't need vehicles right now. They need help operating and PPE equipment and stuff like that. So trying to figure out what all we want to put in an application to them so that they understand what they're applying for. And as well, while the 5310, we focus on the nonprofits, our two city-operated transit agencies are also eligible, but we knew they had a lot of other 5307 CRSA and ARP funds. So we have chosen to focus on the nonprofits for these funds. The third challenge was, and interestingly enough, the modesty of the nonprofits. There's been a few nonprofits. The deadline for our application was yesterday, and I know 2 or 3 of them that actually called me from the beginning of this, wondering if what they had a need for was eligible, and then they didn't apply. So I'm going to reach out to them and hope that they apply, because on the other hand, we got some nonprofits that are asking for everything just in case it is eligible. So again, trying to be fair to everyone, I want to make sure that everybody's applying and we're giving everyone what they need. The 2 city-operated transit agencies here in our region is METS is on the Indiana side in Evansville, and HART is in Henderson, Kentucky. And really, it was just working with them on how they wanted to spend their funds and when they want to spend their funds. And the ARP funds came out after budgets for both of the agencies were already approved. So now what? Do we go back to the city and say, we don't need any of this local share this year? Or do we keep it and save the ARP funds for next year so that the city can use that for other needs next year? So I think they've decided at this point, since they've already been approved, they're going to keep the funds this year, use the regular 5307, and then we're going to go to the use the ARP funds next year. So those are the multitude of challenges that we've seen here in Evansville at the NPL level.
Okay, thank you much. Let's move over to Kendra. And
Thank you, Charles. Well, for me, as a public transit operator, I think that in the beginning, as far as annual apportionments and the challenges that we faced was we're not used to having any kind of money like that dumped on us. As most of you out there who are transit providers are aware, we're used to rubbing 2 nickels together and seeing how far we can get with it. So as this money began to come in addition to watching numbers plummet and seeing contractual services come to a screeching halt, I think for us, the biggest challenge was trying to, before we knew, we were unaware of what kind of a time frame we were going to have on this. And you get this 100% reimbursable money. And I think that once we learned that there wasn't going to be a time frame on it, the biggest challenge that we faced was trying to sit back and settle in and determine the best way to proceed with this funding. What was it going to be paying a $40 travel reimbursements, or were we going to stretch it out a little bit, and how we were going to manage all this? Again, as we learned that there was no time frame on it, that has loosened up a little bit. We feel like we have a good plan put into place. But as far as getting the money obligated, I really have to commend the Oklahoma Department of Transportation, because they did a great job with getting the funds out there. I also run a 5311C operation. That has been a little bit different. Of course, planning for 100% reimbursable money with a tribal operation isn't the same as a public operation because we're 100% anyways. But I think that just having the ability to sit down and look at things and to not panic and to figure out a plan moving forward, a thoughtful process to put into place for how we were going to manage this. What was the biggest challenge in the beginning? In addition to all this funding that we have here at Pelham, we also have a $1.5 million FTA grant, IMI grant that my team is trying to manage as well. So it's been quite challenging, but I think that we've done a good job with being able to fluctuate between capital and operations. We've spent the majority of it on operations, but I think that those were the biggest challenges, was just to be able to be thoughtful in the process of how we intended to spend this money.
okay, thank you much. Dee Dee, we'd like to hear from you.
Thank you, everybody. First of all, I would definitely like to thank CTAA and all the participants and stakeholders for advocating for Section 5310 to be a part of the CRISA and the American Rescue Plan. Definitely this funding was much needed, but we didn't have like the challenges. And I like to echo what Matt said regarding, getting the funding out to 5310. What we found was that the operating side of CRISA and ARP was much needed by our nonprofit agencies. As you know, operating funds are very scarce to come by for our nonprofits. And what we found was that we had actually a little more than $1 million apportioned from both sources, but we had about $4.1 million worth of requests from our nonprofits. And I see Matt shaking his head. And, you know, this was a really great opportunity for our nonprofit agencies to get operating funding, which is not always available. And what we're finding is that what they were more focused on this funding than applying for our traditional section 5310 application and capital. And as you know, a lot of our nonprofits were really hit. You know, it has with all transit agencies, lower riderships. And, you know, some are seeing even their drivers, you know, pulling out. So we were really fortunate. And again, thank you for CTAA and all those who advocated for 5310 be part of this. So we're able to roll our these funding portions into our Section 5310 application process. So we were able to get, and we just finished. We're tying up our loose ends and finishing up this process. But it just shows the need of operating for our nonprofits. We are in partnerships with all of the transit agencies here today. You know, they fill in that gap of transportation services. But, you know, the challenge is there is just not enough funding for transportation across the board.
Okay, very good, thank you. Andy, have you got anything to add?
Maybe just a little bit. I mean, it sounds like we probably had a lot of the same challenges that a lot of people did, you know, trying to figure out between operating and capital, you know, how quickly can we spend it? But on the other hand, we wanted to make sure that we were very strategic in our decisions. We wanted to, you know, not knowing obviously how long this was going to last, trying to figure out, you know, are we going to need some of this to help sustain operations? How long we're going to have to help them with that? And so we really partnered a lot with our transit industry to get their input on this and kind of how important it was for them to have operating or capital. And most of them decided that they really did want it for operating. That's where they felt like they were really taking the biggest hit. And so we also, like I said, wanted to be a little bit strategic about this. And so we set aside some money to do some rural statewide projects also that MDOT is taking the lead on. So we're doing a technology assessment for all of our rural transit agencies to find out, you know, what technology they have, what they need, what they would use, you know, how that could benefit them, especially in another, God forbid, anything like this ever happens again. But, you know, if there is any other kind of an emergency, you know, how we could help them out with that. And that may or may not lead to some kind of statewide technology procurement. We're not sure about that yet. A lot of these are just getting started. We also did a media campaign. It was, you know, everybody heard about all the frontline workers, but how many times did you hear that transit drivers were included with frontline, you know, workers? And so we wanted to make sure we got that message out around the state that, you know, these transit agencies, these buses kept rolling. And, you know, and they were getting people to medical appointments. And if people couldn't get out, they were taking people, you know, prescriptions and food and being very resourceful and to make sure that their customers are still being served. We're also looking at some kind of statewide MOS application. So we'll be able to, again, hopefully never have to, but if we ever need to, we'd be able to kind of hook up statewide on what different areas are doing. And then we're also looking at doing emergency preparedness plans for our rural systems. And so we're going to be looking to see if they already have a plan. If they do have a plan, what's included in it? Do they need to have something else included? Do they need to start thinking about, you know, if there happens to be another pandemic or any other kind of emergency they haven't thought about? And where if they don't have a plan at all, you know, what they need to start planning for. And so we're looking to do that for our rural transit systems. We too also included the ferry boat systems with 5311 operating this year, which we don't typically do for them. We do give them state money a lot of times for capital, but so they were able to get some 5311 operating, which they were very happy to receive. And another challenge too that we had, but it's also a great opportunity, was for the 5310 agencies. They don't typically get operating from us. And so we had to quite quickly train them on what was eligible for operating. And not only that, but what we're going to need to get from them to be able to reimburse them. You know, they are very used to getting capital from us. They send us an invoice and we pay it. Well, with operating, as we know, it's always a little bit different. What kind of invoices do we need? You know, we don't typically get that from them. So we've been working with them to get them some much needed operating assistance also.
Okay, thanks very much. I think what we've heard, and these are excellent summaries of the challenges that faced, but the opportunities that have been described as well. I think what I've heard is that for every challenge, there seems to have been a number of opportunities that corresponded with that, and you've taken advantage of those things. As a follow-on question, I'd like to know from each one of you what barriers you continue to face. Now, we've talked about the challenges and opportunities and the great things that you're doing right now. That's collectively as well as individually. But just succinctly, give us what the barriers are that you still face. We're talking about expending this money, getting it out the door. And when we started our initial discussion, it wasn't for the sake of spend it because we have it, but meeting those pressures of getting the money obligated, putting it out on the street, letting it have an impact. What are the barriers that you face? Let's go with Don this time.
Sure. The biggest pragmatic thing that we're dealing with right now is in the intercity bus industry. And that we've already awarded all of our CARES money for that, and we expect it to be spent down pretty quickly. Part of the challenge is contracting with private for-profit entities too, and they take one look at those 5311 requirements, and if they're not a traditional provider, they blanch. But the other part that's really hard with the intercity bus industry is I don't want to give them any CRISA until I know what's going on with the Treasury process. And so for those on the call that don't know, the Treasury got the CRISA money for intercity bus, and they haven't done any process yet. I know they've done some outreach, but they haven't done any awards yet. And so we're kind of waiting to find out what they're going to do with the money before we award any more CRISA or ARP to intercity bus providers. Similar to what someone else said about folks being shy, I'm a little bit surprised within the intercity bus industry that, not Greyhound, but many of the smaller ones don't want to admit when they're having problems. And so we're running into a situation where I know, for example, one of my providers isn't paying rent on their stations, but every time we go to them, are you sure that you're healthy and doing everything? Oh yeah, everything's fine. And so I'm a little bit. That's something else that we're trying constantly to work through that we haven't quite been successful on. And I think partially again it becomes to those private for-profits that they're not used to sharing their business with other people. And I think we're running into that a little bit right now.
Okay, thank you. What have you got to share on that, Kristen?
Sure. So barriers, probably again, the overlapping timeframes on all the different funding sources is a challenge, plus trying to encourage the use of their regular 5310 money. But overall, I think the oversight guidance really is something we would like to see prior to issuing any CRISA or our contracts for our transit agencies, because we want to know, and I'm guessing they would like to know too, what strings are tied to the money that will be coming down. So that's another challenge where we're not necessarily doling out these dollars yet because we're wanting to have that oversight guidance first. So we're not really making many plans yet.
Okay, thank you. And I think I heard you say the absence of guidance from your perspective, the absence of guidance. And I know that we all should be very cautious of asking for additional strings, but we do want clarification. So I'm not speaking for you, but I just want to throw that out there.
Yes, I'm not asking for guidance, but if there's going to be some,
okay.
Give it to us. Yes.
Okay. Kendra, how about from your perspective?
Well, I think for us, and I noticed somebody put in the chat, the staffing issue, and staffing is a huge issue, obviously, in the industry right now. I'm hopeful that some of that might alleviate itself come September. But I think that as far as being a transit provider goes, the biggest barrier that we face is, in my opinion, is not necessarily getting the money obligated and expended. It's what happens next. Is looking to the future. Where do we go when what happens when the money is gone? How do we plan accordingly to meet the match, and what does it look like in Oklahoma, in the state, in the nation? What does it look like for us once this money is gone, and how do we proceed with local match? For one thing, one of the things that we're finding is that the cities get their CARES Act money, we have our money, and they maybe think that we have enough CARES Act money that we don't need the same local match that we always have. So one of the things that we're doing as a transit agency is looking to see how we can very wisely and thoughtfully implement some new routes, new technologies into our system that are going to make things more attractive moving forward in 3 years, so that we have a reason to go back and get match and maintain those same levels of local match. But I think that I can speak safely for everyone when we say what it looks like in 3 years is probably the biggest fear and barrier that rural providers and tribal providers are facing at this time. So.
Okay, very good. And that's one of the questions that we were going to focus on, but we're going to get a little bit more information from a couple of other folks on these barriers. Let's see. Dee, have you got something to provide?
I would just, thank you. I would just like to add, yes, I think one of the barriers is, especially for 5310 subrecipients, is oversight on the, the CRISA and the ARP, is that because they haven't been able to be, have an opportunity to participate in operating, is the oversight of the reimbursement and expending the funding and making sure we get the funding out. We worked really hard and diligently. I think somebody said, it was just a short time, and a lot of money for us, for nonprofits, is a short time and little money. But we did a really good job. We worked with our designated recipient and ICM, our state DOT. We had open conversations on their plan on getting this funding out. But now comes the hard part, the barrier part, is that, this is new territory for nonprofits, for operating, and submitting their reimbursements, ensuring that they're meeting federal requirements, working hard, working with them. And we are definitely here to support it. Another barrier that I see is that this was such a great opportunity for operating at 100% match, and trying to keep up that momentum and keep up those services and trying to provide that support. Mm-hmm. This is great. We would like to see some additional funding. If anybody has any pull here, that'd be great today. But it is a blessing, and there are challenges with those blessings, as always.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. For any of the other panelists, I'm going to let you volunteer to throw something in right now in that regard.
I'll throw a couple things out there. Some people have already touched on a little bit. One thing, we also have a van pooling program. We call it Michivan. And it's been a challenge because they're not viewed as public transit. And so they don't get the public transit funds, but yet they're still out there providing service. And so I know that they've reached out to some of the 5307 agencies to see if they could get some, because, they report to NTD for them. And so they get the additional 5307, but they have not been successful in getting any additional funds out of these programs. So it'd be nice if they can be considered. But then on the other side of that, I don't know if other states got lists out from FTA as far as, the face masks that we had to provide and some other different things. And they had some agencies in there that we don't typically work with. I mean, for an example, one of them was the U of M parking garage, which apparently they must be providing some kind of transportation. I don't know if they're reporting to NTD, but somehow they got on FTA's list. And so now we're kind of concerned too, what's going to be the impact? Are we going to have to try to continue to fund these agencies that we've never had to work with before? Because we don't know how they became part of our program, but they're there now. And another thing that we've talked about is, I know you guys, a lot of people have been talking about like the local funds. and that, you know, your legislators or something might not see that you need those local funds anymore. We're kind of facing that a little bit on the state side. You know, when they do our apportionments for us, they're like, oh, you guys got all that CARES funding, you don't need anything else. And it's like, no, you know, these funds are for something totally different, you know, so trying to continuously educate them. And also we get a lot of, because we provide the match for our transit agency. So that's why the local funds isn't so much an issue, but we have the FHWA flex funds that they get. And we're getting some of like the road commissions now saying, no, they don't need those funds because they're getting all this CARES Act. And we're again trying to educate, saying, you know, these funds, we're primarily using those for operating, and they can't use these flex funds for operating. So they do still have a need for the flex funds. They do still have to get some capital with that. And so please, you know, don't think that these CARES funds replaced, you know, what we had before. It's to help replace lost revenues. So there's been a lot of educating that we've also been trying to do through this.
Very good, very good. Anyone else?
Only thing I could add was through the application process that we did, just digging through these now that they're coming in and trying to figure out, again, how to make it fair for everyone. I mentioned earlier, between the two programs, we got $86,000 for Section 5310 to go for the nonprofits. And we had one applicant apply for $62,000. I didn't set a limit, but I did let him know that there was $86,000 available. And so if anybody wants to help me tell her why she can't get all that money, I'd appreciate it. But no, so yeah, figuring out how to make sure that we're being fair to everyone is the next challenge for me.
Okay. All right. We're going to move this along a bit because we do want to get some opportunity to get questions out of the chat box or observations, and then open it for one or two questions and comments. You talked about in your presentations, or your comments rather, I heard the theme of partnering with other organizations, whether it be MPOs or the transit community. How about the non-traditional partners? Have you partnered with any of those organizations in order to not necessarily develop a plan, but the strategy for how to spend that money? And forgive me, panelists, I know that that question was not phrased that way initially, but I just thought we could throw that out there in terms of any non-traditional partners that you've worked with.
I guess I could say it's not that they're not a traditional, but as an NPO, we don't work with the state too much with the 5310 and 5307 money available to us. Mm-hmm. But I have a committee that meets that expands beyond our NPO region. And I got a call from someone about, well, what about the state? What's the state doing? So I was able to connect the state and a nonprofit just outside of our area. So they're aware of what the state was trying to do. So just making that extra connection help the nonprofit and help the state decide on a few things.
Okay.
I think as an industry, not necessarily WashDOT specific, a lot more work with senior centers, food banks, places like that where we kind of turned on a dime from putting a lot of focus on bringing people to goods and services to bringing goods and services to the people. Yes. And so that has been a great opportunity, and maybe from the sake of coordination, we can continue a lot of those new relationships going forward.
Has anyone on the panel been involved with health departments or community health centers?
Yes.
Because these are key players in trying to respond to the pandemic. I'm wondering, have there been relationships developed?
I would say not necessarily developed, they were already there, but expanded upon, especially with our Department on Aging and our area agencies on aging in terms of meal deliveries and vaccine access and distribution, all of that. And we've worked with our governor's office on communicating availability of public transit and things like that. So I think a lot of awareness about public transit has popped up out of this. And so we'll come out of this with that as a positive. So it's been a rough year, but there have been some good things to come out of all of this.
Very good. Very good. Moving to another question, and this is we're going to look at a very targeted answer from each of you, if there is an answer that you care to offer. What has been the most important change that's been made by state and or federal government that has helped to make this work for you? So let's go. I think I saw Don raise his hand right away.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure I got this point out, so I'm really glad you asked the question. FTA's programming and trams took a figurative 5 minutes. It was the best programming and trams that we experienced that we've ever been through. So big kudos to FTA and specifically to Region 10 for their hustle and their assistance in getting that money programmed. And I would love to see just as we were just talking about, see if this is something we can build upon in the future. But it was quite amazing.
Okay.
I want to second that too, Don, because that was the first thing that I put on my list when I started thinking about this, is how quickly they turn those grants around. It's like, why can't it always be like that? It's like, and I understand that, it was, that was kind of directed that you get these funds out quickly, but, it was just very seamless. It was very nice, they got it out quickly. The flexibility that they also allowed to use for some of the, the funds, like with the meal delivery and the package delivery and extending those due date, that was very, very helpful for our state. And also, their frequently asked questions site, they were keeping that very up to date, and that was very helpful. We referenced that a lot. So those were a couple of things that I really found very helpful for the federal government that they've really stepped up to help us with.
And I think much as I chimed in about the local match being an issue possibly later on, but the 100% funding has been extremely helpful. And if we could make that permanent somehow, that would really take a big burden off of our local transit agencies, because then they could go out and seek local funding for maybe new pilot projects and trying new things rather than sustaining the current services that they have. So I think that's been a positive.
I'm glad Kristen brought that up, and I want to re-emphasize that so we can make sure that point got carried through to what came out of this session. So the 100% funding, there still is a need for substantial investment. Kendra, were you going to say something? I didn't want to cut you off.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo their sentiments that I think that moving through the trans process, this was the quickest it had ever been. And I felt like the FTA really moved quickly and made it probably the most seamless process I've ever dealt with transit, and ODOT as well. The state DOTs have done an excellent job of providing guidance and being spot on with us. And again, it's been, that has made things so much more simple, just having that be a much smoother and priority process, so.
Okay, we can move then to the outward forward look. And some of you've talked about this already, but what do you anticipate it's going to be necessary to keep the momentum going? Because we've built some momentum. Things are going, they're really moving. And I think that with all objective measures, the money is getting out the door. And the money is being done through a thoughtful process of internal planning and assessment. But what do you think needs to be done to keep the momentum going, even if we don't keep the funding levels that we've been so fortunate to experience? Let's go with Matt. Have you got any comments on that?
Yeah, so the biggest thing is with Metz and Hart, the city transit operators, the CARES and ARP funding that they got helped them not hardly spend any money from their normal 5307 funds. So they've got a lot of money that they're going to be able to use over the next 3 years. And so being able to use that to the best of their ability with the local match. And again, I know we've talked about this before, the local match might go down for the city. So here in 3 or 4 years, when it's going to go back up to, the levels that they were pre-pandemic, hopefully the city realizes that the agencies are going to need that additional funding. I had another point, but yeah, that's the main thing. Is just so we've been working with a healthcare group and looking at expanding service. And one of the things that we're looking into with all this additional 5307 funding that METS is saving is if we can work with that group to come up with the local share that METS won't have to pay anything and expand METS service without METS paying a dime. If METS is able to give up some of their 5307 funding, you know, that would be a big help for that area.
Okay, let's see who we've got now that wants to. Andy, did you give us anything on that question?
I can.
Okay.
Yeah, one thing I think we're kind of taking the opposite approach, and we're kind of trying to tell transit agencies, please don't try to expand your service right now, because we don't know what this is going to look like after the, you know, kind of the windfall, I'm going to call it. Yes, we've been able to save up some of our regular 5311 that we'll be able to help them out with, because we provide them a lot of operating assistance. But we want to, you know, kind of start thinking ahead as far as what is their ridership going to look like. And that's part of the reason why we did the statewide media campaign, and so they can kind of maybe help us look to see, because the ridership's not going to be the same. If we continue to work from home, which they're telling us, you know, at MDOT anyway, that we could continue working from home infinitely, you know, we don't know when we'll ever go back. So, you know, if you're not getting all those rides to work, what is your ridership going to look like, you know, and how can you plan for that? So we're kind of trying to focus more on that side about what it's going to look like then. And we're hoping, you know, to help sustain some of this, FTA will allow us to be flexible. But one thing I'm going to throw out there too is we're really hoping that NTD reporting doesn't start cracking down, because we know in the next couple of years, things are going to change. Our ridership is not going to be the same. Our miles are not going to be, our hours are not. And so until we get through what is the new service going to look like after this, I think that we're going to need some flexibility on that also.
Very good, very good. I saw something that came through the chat. I think Scott Bogren indicated that he wanted to comment on this, and I don't want to miss that opportunity. Scott, are you still there?
No, Charles, I just wanted to, I would really reemphasize what Andy just said, you know, being cautious right now and understanding what's happening. And, you know, I was really responding. I was so happy to hear public health, incidental services being raised as those new partners, and CTAA, we're going to be putting together a white paper, hopefully releasing it in June, that kind of captures a lot of what happened operationally with different types of transit systems, so that move forward can be one that is informed by what we've done here, and we don't lose, not just, as you mentioned, the funding momentum, but also kind of the partnership and some of the other pieces.
Okay. Any other panel members?
I just want to chime in with planning. You know, there was we did a big effort here, largely at my boss, Roger Millar's direction, about rethinking transit and mobility. And so we brought lots of our partners together to talk about what the world's going to look like in 3 years, and really focused on building consensus for what the next steps are, because it might be a missed opportunity otherwise to try. What do we try, just to go back to the way it was, or do we take advantage of this crisis and make sure that people are thinking about not just how it was, but how it should be?
Very good, very good. Someone else on the panel?
Charles, I'd like to speak to this for just a moment. I think that, first of all, I want to comment on what my lovely colleagues, Julia and Gail, said in the chat box. Gail, I think that Gail made a very strong point about the driver issue. We can have all the money in the world, but if we can't get drivers, then it really doesn't matter. It's almost impossible to get it out the door. And what we're doing here at Pelican, and Andy, you touched on this too, I think that, as Julia stated, and as I was stating earlier, it's important right now to put things into place that are sustainable. And Andy, like you said, what we're doing here at Pelican, we've got together a thoughtful plan for spending our money, but we want to put sustainable pieces into place. And we don't plan on expanding our system right now, because we don't think that that's the best idea, because we don't know where it's going. So we're looking to enhance what we already have. I think that making smart, sensible investments through technology that provides efficiencies in the systems and provide a more sustainable system moving forward is the key right now to successful match in the future and things of that nature. We're going back and forth between our 5311 and our CARES Act money. And in the meantime, we have to spend this Biden money that's 3 years operational, I believe. So we're looking to reduce our local match by about 50% by going back and forth between the two. And again, plan on implementing some technologies and things that we feel will be more attractive when we go back in 2 years or 3 years and ask the cities for more money. Well, this is what we did during COVID while managing a pandemic and running the system. We implemented these new things, and we're hopeful that that will help maybe bridge some of that gap between the match money and the issues that we anticipate with it.
I think those are excellent comments. And to go back to Don's word a few minutes ago, planning, I think, is one of the keys that we've got to keep in the forefront. Planning on how we manage, program, and invest those dollars to have the long-term impact, because it's going to be critical. We know that we've got some timelines, some time-sensitive dates that we've got to meet. But no matter what comes after this, we still got to have some rationale and some methodology for using this money that we can say we are accountable and we are making investments for a return on those dollars. So I'm glad to hear that. I saw one comment in the chat box that was seemingly related to that. Any other of the panel members want to chime in on that? We're talking now about going forward. I think partnerships has a lot to do with going forward as well, but from your perspective.
Hi, I just want to say once again that having the 5310 subrecipients included in CRESA and ARP is such a great momentum going forward. This opportunity was a catalyst for us to talk to other stakeholders outside of our nonprofit area, talking to our regional transportation authority, talking to municipalities, and talking to our transit agency, transit association. This was a great opportunity to start up that dialogue. We're all in the same area. We're providing services for our community members that don't, have the transportation opportunities always. Public transit is an alternative transportation. It's there. It's on a schedule. It helps a community, thrive. The nonprofits fill in that gap of transportation services. But this funding opportunity also sent a message saying, we want your transportation services to be safe. We want the consumers back. We're very, we are willing to put funding and ensure to make this happen. And I know a lot of agencies have lost drivers. They're coming back, hopefully again, but this is such a great opportunity and a catalyst to keep this momentum going. Where do we see 3 years from now? Unfortunately, when we've had the experience in the back where we lost funding, and specifically in 2007, we lost funding to transit. We got that funding back again, but you never really catch up when you have a deficit with funding. We want to be very conscientious of how we move forward, making sure that we're good stewards of federal funds. But again, like I said, this is a great opportunity to get this dialogue going, sharing best practices and working with others outside of our normal, outside the box, outside of our normal stakeholders. Thank you.
Question for DOTs specifically, going forward, and we've had a comment about the NTD, which can be a bane, and I think it's going to be an increased asset as we go forward. Once people look at the realities of how the data can be applied, we can work through some of those. But are we collecting the kind of information to tell the story, to support the performance and the impacts, so that in the out years, we can talk about not just this was COVID, but what grew out of COVID that ultimately changed and then resulted in more inclusion and a greater bang for the buck. That's just throwing it out there from some of my DOT cohorts.
Well, one of the things I know that we're doing in Washington State as part of our COVID dashboard that is maintained by the governor's office, we are tracking ridership and a couple of sales tax collection and a couple of other key indicators to kind of see, track what happened, help make decisions on phases, but also help us with planning and figuring out what happened here, what can we learn from it, so that we're more prepared for the next pandemic.
That's good. Someone else?
I don't know for collecting specifically then, I mean, we always collect that every year, we have to collect it. And so yes, at some point we will be using that to see what lessons we can learn from this. And that kind of goes back to like some of the things that we wanted to fund with this, as far as like the marketing, the media campaign, and, you know, technology to see how, you know, if what we use our funds for is going to help us in the future. And, you know, the emergency preparedness plan. So we are looking ahead while using some of these funds and hoping that we can learn some lessons from it. Again, kind of comes back to what I was saying before too. We don't know what ridership's going to look like. You know, maybe, hopefully we're going to get more people using it for maybe social instead of for work. You know, we don't know. You know, obviously people are still going to be getting to the doctors and stuff like that. So yes, we're going to continue to collect the information and hopefully in a few years be able to look back and say, okay, what did we learn from it and where can we go from here?
Very good, very good. Someone else, we want to open this up. I think we've covered quite a number of things. And I want us to feel comfortable that we looked at the opportunities more than we looked at the challenges, because I think we universally have come up with some consistent challenges. Do you think we've addressed?
Sure. Here at Pell Van Transit, we work our tribal partners. We work with the Northeast Tribal Transit Consortium, which we also operate, and with the Cherokee Nation. And I think that a good idea for some of the time that we have here as we move forward through this process is to sit down with, I think that creating regional systems in addition to that provide services that would benefit an entire region rather than just an individual system, sitting down with stakeholders and potentially pooling some of your resources to purchase technology, I think is a solid plan at any time. But it's something that we do at Pell Van a lot, and it works very well. And I think that with coordination being such the heart of mobility, I think that this would be a good time to start sitting down with some of those people. A small mobility ecosystem is still an ecosystem. So regardless of whether you have one social service agency and 4 providers or vice versa, I think it works.
Thank you very much. I think that, I don't know if Kendra, if somehow you have appeared mysteriously in some of our staff meetings recently, because these are some of the same issues that folks in Mississippi are dealing with and going forward with, made quite a bit of progress. I think, and we're heading toward kind of wrapping things up, but I would want to say that I really appreciate you giving of your time, putting on your thinking caps and sharing this information, not only with just your peers, but I hope the folks from FTA have picked up some good information from what they've heard here. I know that the relationships that we've built over the years with MPOs, with local COGs, transit providers, and I cannot stress enough from my perspective, we've got to reestablish and grow those partnerships with the non-traditional entities out there, because transportation has to evolve. It is needed. It's not going to be back to the good old days, because the good old days may not look like the good old days as we go forward. But I really want to open this up for any of you panelists who have any closing remarks that you want to make. Don't be bashful, folks.
I'll start. I just want to commend everybody out there for a job well done. COVID has, as Dee Dee said, there's always a blessing with every curse usually and a curse with every blessing. So this has not been an easy time. It's been a great time to lead though, in my opinion. And I just want to, again, commend everyone for a great job throughout the last year. It's not been easy. I know we've all spent a lot of sleepless nights, but I just have great respect and appreciation for everyone out there and the job that's been done.
Okay. No one else?
Very similar. I just want to thank, I'll be more specific and thank the people on this call who arranged this call. It was great to hear from my colleagues and find out what you're doing. I'd invite anybody who has any questions about some of the things I said to follow up with me directly. I'm more than happy to chat more.
I guess I would follow up with a call to maybe repeat this in another year. Same topic. And as we get further out from this and, you know, we've got all of our funding sources and we have spent a chunk of them and know kind of how things are shaking out, maybe we talk again on what's happened over the next year. So yeah, I think this has been a good discussion and learned what everybody's going through and learned we're not alone.
Fantastic.
I agree with that. I also wanted to say too with that I wouldn't mind doing this in a couple of years too, that, you know, we keep talking about the opportunities. So let's come back in a couple of years and see what opportunities we took away from this. You know, we've all struggled through and there's a lot of decisions to be made and we're making quick decisions and hopefully good decisions, but I'll be really curious to see where we're at here in a couple of years.
Someone
Well,
else?
if your work is not done, you still have to moderate the discussion among all the participants now. You can't get out of this that easily.
Go ahead, Richard.
No, I'm turning it back on. As you can see, the slide's up for a discussion among all participants.
Well, that's what we were going to do. We want to get our panelists first, and then we're going to try to pull folks in because we've got some really good comments that are in the chat box, but we want to open it up to anyone else that's on the call.
Now is the time, folks.
There are some specific kinds of questions in the weeds, questions that if we have time we can get into, but I think folks have offered to follow up on specific questions from each individual panelist.
Since FTA is on the phone, do they have to phone? I keep saying phone, we're not on the phone. Since the FTA is involved in this meeting, do they have anything to comment on, Marianne? As I put her on the spot.
Trying to, can you hear me? I'm
Yes.
trying to put my camera on. I don't know. Oh, there we go. So thank you. I just put it in the chat. I guess what I would say is I really appreciate. I actually took about 4 pages of notes when you all were talking, and I really appreciate hearing about your challenges, your barriers, and your success, which is really commendable and fantastic. And especially thank you for acknowledging FTA's super duper CARES Act, getting the money into trams and over to you guys as fast as was humanly possible under the circumstances. So we appreciate that you appreciate that. I appreciate hearing all of these issues, and it's giving me a lot of sort of food for thought, as well as information that I think, you know, the leadership at FTA will be interested in hearing. And I'm gonna, you know, try to find a way to communicate that. We are often asked some of the similar questions that you all talked about having to answer. Why isn't the money, you know, being spent quicker? You know, what are the challenges and barriers? And and you know, and soon, I think we've still been wrapped up in kind of what's going on currently, but I think soon we're going to be asked what to do about the future. You know, that's within our power, or how we can help you all meet the future. And so this, just having listened today, you know, just gives me a great foundation to begin to chew on some of those issues. So thank you.
Want to emphasize, Marianne, that one of the things there was a theme kind of throughout a lot of these discussions. The flexibility has been one of those things that people have acknowledged has made the difference in being able to respond. A number of folks have realized that we've got to think strategically more than just tactical, because responding to the pandemic. We were in full tactical mode. We got to make it happen. We got to get this done today, this tomorrow. But the strategic process and working with FTAs, giving us support and guidance, I think is going to be invaluable as we go through looking at how strategically we can move forward.
Absolutely. So yeah, we will keep the dialogue open. You know, I guess the big, as far as the flexibility goes, you mentioned flexibility, and I think we have done our best through this emergency situation with the pandemic to, you know, make available all of the flexibility that is under our power. In some cases, we are or will be in the future more limited by, you know, statutory limitations, and there's some things that we can't, you know, some types of flexibility that we will not be able to continue unless the statutes are changed. But on the other hand, we have now is a great time to begin to influence, because reauthorization is coming up. So I don't have a lot of control over that process either, but I guess I'm just urging you, to the extent that you all as transit agencies or MTAP as an organization or CTAA, you know, can sort of take some of this knowledge that we've sort of gleaned during this emergency situation and see how that might translate to changes in law that you might want to see, and then talk about that with the people that have the power to do it.
I think that's an excellent point. Excellent point. Someone else, please. Scott or Jim Diamond, do you have any remarks that you would want to make?
Well, thanks, Charles. This is Scott. I mean, I'd still really welcome from any of the participants, email me directly, bogren@ctaa.org. How do we discuss the rationale for it taking longer to spend these funds? I find myself being asked that quite often. And I think we have decent answers, but you're on the front lines of that. You're understanding it's going to take 2 or 3 years in some cases, and that's okay. Anything you can contribute that we can use to make sure we're communicating effectively, that this doesn't mean it's not needed. It doesn't mean it's not valued. It just means it takes a little bit longer to spend down. I would appreciate your thoughts on that. So that's kind of where I am, Charles.
Okay, very good. I've heard some people say earlier, and we've had some previous conversations, that if we can get the mindset that we are about making investments rather than just making expenditures, that it carries some weight with that. The investments are forward thinking. State of good repair issues still haven't gone away. You know, capital needs are going to continue to grow. And in some quarters, a discussion of how these monies could perhaps do kind of cost containment measures to keep the cost that we need in those out years down from new money having to be thrown in. We've got some money, let us use that money to help keep those things going. I mean, these are just some observations that I've heard some people, but I really want to make sure that we're not cutting anyone else's chain of thought off now, because we're going to wrap it up in a few minutes, but this is the time to put it on the table.
Are there any other participants, not even just the panelists, who want to say a few words about the topic, about some of the questions, the challenges, the opportunities, the barriers? Again, it was stressed at the beginning of this call that, I mean, FTA, you know, expressed a real concern about this. I mean, that's really the sort of the impetus for doing this. And we're, again, happy that FTA is on the phone. Marianne's a wonderful partner. And we just want to make sure that there are other folks here that please share your perspective. You know, this can't be just, unless everyone's just saying, I agree. That's exactly what I'm going through. I assume there's different perspectives. So again, you turn on your camera, open up your mic, and feel free. I'm sorry we've gone long, but I thought this would be something I shouldn't cut off, a conversation that should not be cut off. and deservedly so. It's a very important discussion.
I think Julia Castillo in the chat made a good point about the rural systems being really frugal and kind of leery about spending all the money quickly and not knowing what the future holds. So I think they're being very responsible, frankly, in trying to use this money as best they possibly can and make it stretch as long as it can. And also, I think one thing that seems to get forgotten is, especially with these rural systems, is they have extremely small staffs for the services that they provide. And there were, when this money first came down, it was really about keeping buses on the roads and their drivers healthy, and they didn't necessarily have time to sit down and think, oh, well, how can I plan this out and get to spending this money. It was, touch and go there for a while for a lot of these agencies. So I think you can't just, turn on a dime on having funding raining on you where normally it's trickling. So I think it's just been a difficult and good problem to have, but the speed with which we're spending it, I don't think should be an issue quite yet because we're still in the pandemic.
I just wanted to say something on that too, is a lot of these agencies, their operating expenses went down because their service went down, and so when we're giving them an operating assistance, typically, if we gave them 18%, now we're giving them 30%, it's about the same amount of money. Because their service dropped so much, so that's part of it too, and there's some other reasons, but it's kind of goes along too. They're frugal, but we at MDOT are making a lot of the decisions for our rural agencies. With their input, talking to the industry, how do they want to use this? What's the biggest impact for them? So even though, so that's why kind of coming back to some of the other things that we wanted to do to try to help them out, and we also did set aside quite a bit for capital, so that they're able, and because capital funds you can usually spend quicker than some of the operating. So we did set some aside for that. But to Scott's point, I will continue to have some conversations, and we will get something back to you. I got your email here. Kind of the rationale behind what we think is, why it might be taking longer than what people think that it should take for us to spend these.
Well, Richard, I would like to say that I think through our MTAP membership, through the CTAA's active involvement, we've got other opportunities to have further discussions, meaningful discussions going forward. And we owe it to our constituents to summarize some of the answers or some of the possible solutions and make sure we can keep that out there that folks can utilize. I know that reauthorization is a significant issue through the CTAA. Looking at getting what the input from the transit community is. Don leading us with the MTAP program. We've got our membership through the steering committee that's really looking at these hard issues and coming up with answers and possible solutions, if not solutions, options. So discussing this and developing some kind of planning process that we can keep track of where we are, where we're going, where we'd like to be, is what I'd like to offer. Thank you. Richard, you're muted.
All right, I should know better. Charles, as usual, gets the last word on that one. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a wrap. Thank you. I also thought, like I said, I will share information with CTAA. I will publish this stuff through MTAP's e-news. And if you happen to be on LinkedIn, I will probably post it to my LinkedIn page as well. So check me out on LinkedIn. Thanks, everyone. Great conversation. Appreciate you all being here. And we will see you at the next one. Take care, y'all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, y'all.
Thanks.